So, Seth, you'll get to do the same. If there is some fact you could share about you that would make everyone feel here that, yeah, this Seth guy, I've known him his whole life.
One of my favorite facts is I once beat, anyone know who Magnus Carlsen is? Yeah. World chess champion. I once beat Magnus Carlsen. At a game of ping pong. Excellent. Yeah, excellent point. But this look at that. This inspired me to, at some point when I'm near ready to retire, I actually want to go and challenge all of the champions at different sports to something that they're likely not very good at.
Oh, that's perfect.
Because I think, for two reasons. One, I think the story would be great, and maybe it can turn into a book or something. And then two, it would really satisfy me to be able to say that I beat the world champion at, basically every sport alive. And so someday that might be a journey and adventure that I take.
And a practice of humbleness for all the great champions across the world.
Now you know me.
Awesome. And I mean, Seth, I think that most people here will probably have heard about 50 years, but to not take that for granted, if you were to just give that brief overview of what it is that you actually do.
Yeah, so basically we support founders that are using deep technology, which simply means you probably need a PhD on the team to pull things off, to solve the world's biggest problems with businesses that can generate huge capital returns. So if you imagine a Venn diagram where one circle is deep tech, one circle is path to $1 billion a year in revenue if things go really well, and one circle is path to massive positive social or environmental impact. The intersection of those three at the very, very early stages, that's our sweet spot. And then we partner with founders often as their first check, and then we help them build their companies.
And the name 50 years.
50 years, the name actually comes from an essay that was written in 1931 by, of all people, Winston Churchill. Everyone should read this essay. He, in the first part of it, predicts nuclear power, satellite telephony, synthetic biology, genetic engineering, and then so just incredible deep tech insight. And then in the second part of the essay, he talks about how because the pace of technology is advancing so rapidly, that it's more important than ever that technologists take a principled approach to their work, because otherwise we might accelerate really fast but in the wrong direction. And so this combination of incredible deep tech insight and principled approach to your work for the type of things we like to support, it's really just the perfect essay. The essay is called 50 Years Hence. And we debated about it, but we decided the hence sounded a little old school, so we just dropped it.
Fabulous. And I mean, Seth, was it 2016 you were at Slush? And I remember that then it feels so long ago in a way when it was like you were on stage and saying that, yeah, we believe that companies could be a force for good. So I mean, you've been really a pioneer in this sector. So what would be your reflections on what's happened since then?
Well, I think our ecosystem's gotten a lot better. It's true. We felt very lonely back then. At least, there were a lot of investors or technologists that, thought about making the world a better place, but they typically, thought about it as concessionary, right? So something you can back companies that do good, but you're definitely going to give up some profit when you do it. And the vast majority of people that were working in the impact space weren't thinking really big. They weren't taking the sort of Silicon Valley big swings. They're really bold bets that are likely to fail, but if they don't, can radically move the world forward. And the combination of those two, there was maybe a handful of firms that were backing teams in that space. And I think since we started, it's really 10x, 50x. I mean, we still need another 10x or 50x after this, but I've been really, really inspired about how the thinking, has shifted. There are still some holdouts. So Mark Andreessen of Andreessen Horowitz is famous for saying that this kind of investing is like a houseboat, not a great house, not a great boat. I would say that he's, a bit stuck in the past. And so it's true that there are still some curmudgeons that don't yet see how you can truly combine profit with purpose and how those two things really fuel each other. But for the most part, even the people that aren't in this space, right, they now accept the fact that entrepreneurs that have these big ambitions and that are solving these big problems really have systemic advantages against ones that don't. And I think a lot of that has come because they've seen the data about the sort of generational shift in attitudes. And then part of it has come because there are now some firms, I'm happy to say ours is one, that have shown some really, really great financial performance and have shown that you can, outcompete the sort of best of the best by just focusing on these really important issues.
Yeah, and I mean, now you're among friends, and among friends you can shamelessly brag. So tell us about what would you say are some of the startups that you feel most proud that you've been a part of their journey?
There's quite a lot. Our fund, our first fund, which we launched in 2015, we backed 30 teams, all at the pre-seed or seed. 20% of those are now unicorns, and so that that is a better percentage than Sequoia, right? And I think. One of the big reasons is that those founders are doing genuinely important things. When you do important things, you have these incredible tailwinds. It's also very interesting that of the teams that we backed in 2015 that was basically 2015 to 2017, of those 30, I think 5 have wound down. So 25 out of 30, and these are all pre-seed or seed, super, first round, maybe they raised an angel round. And those stats just are sort of mind-boggling to most investors. And why have so few wound down? Well, it's because if you're working on something truly important, you don't give up. You're much more resilient, right? You keep pushing through. And so there's a lot that we're really proud of. I would say some of the ones that are becoming stars. There's a company called Solugen that we backed. We were lucky to be their first investor. They make carbon-negative chemicals using synthetic biology. So they basically engineer enzymes in a way where they're able to feed these enzymes plant sugars, and the enzymes crank out chemicals. They just crossed $100 million annual run rate recently. They built a 63-foot, I don't know what that is in meters, apologies, a really, really big bioforge, probably as tall as the very top of this building. In Houston, Texas. It's one of the largest, operational synthetic biology plants on Earth, and it makes 12,000 tons per year of their carbon-negative chemicals. They're about to build one that's over twice as large in the Midwest, and so it's just clearly a team where it's working. And I think what's really cool about that is if you look at the investors that came on, Founders Fund, led the Series B. They have Bailey Gifford, they have BlackRock, they have Temasek. These are not, impact investors. These are just the best of the best traditional investors that are now funding them. We backed a team which is top of mind because they're about to launch on a SpaceX rocket in 4 days called Astranis. So they are basically solving the problem that 4 billion people are currently without broadband internet. And there's only and this is a big problem because when people don't have internet, their health is worse, their education outcomes are worse, their economic development is worse, everything is worse basically. And there's only so many ways of getting people internet. So the most common way in the developed world is you run wires under the ground. So that's how this area has broadband, but that's prohibitively expensive in a lot of rural areas. If you're in a mountainous region, it's just impossible. And so Facebook tried solar-powered drones, that didn't work. Google tried these balloons called Project Loon, that didn't work. Most smart people now have landed on satellites as the best solution. So SpaceX is launching what are called low Earth orbit satellites, and this is an amazing thing, and Starlink's really, really great. But they're basically so close to the Earth that they're constantly zipping around, which means they're only overhead for about 7 minutes. So in order to provide anywhere on Earth high uptime internet, you need about 1,000 of these things in space, which means you have to charge a pretty penny for the broadband. So I don't know if anyone here has Starlink, but it's pretty expensive. It's not super cheap. Astranis is making small geostationary satellites, which means as the Earth moves, the satellite moves with it. Which means from their very first satellite, they can provide a place on Earth high uptime internet. And so the trade-off is that the latency is a little bit higher, meaning the time it takes for a signal to go up and back. The speed is basically the same, but the cost is way, way cheaper. And so this is, in our estimation, a much better way of bringing online those 4 billion people who are typically people who don't have a huge amount of cash. We were also fortunate to be their first VC investor. They raised their Series A by Andreessen Horowitz, of all people, and then have gone on and are now $1.4 billion company and are launching on the Falcon 9 at Cape Canaveral on Tuesday, and I get to go and see it, so I'm very excited.
Oh, that's awesome. And I mean, now when we're in the spirit of, in a friendly way, bashing Andreessen Horowitz, I think I heard you a while back saying that VC has lost its way.
Yeah.
Yeah, would you like to expand on that?
It's complete. I mean, I think VC is maybe symptomatic of like a larger symptom, but I think, the Solugen, one of the founders is a really great example. So one of the co-founder and is a MIT-trained chemical engineer, PhD chemical engineer. And in chemical engineering, when you graduate, you typically either go work for oil and gas, or you often go work in the food industry. And he went to work in the food industry after he graduated. And his job at the company was to use, like, he would literally coat food in gold, and you'd use mass spectrometry and crazy chemical engineering techniques to optimize the shine of Cocoa Puffs. I'm just completely 100% not making this up. So it turns out that different regions like different levels of shininess on their Cocoa Puffs. So in America, we like moderately shiny. In Latin America, they like very shiny. And in Europe, you guys like matte Cocoa Puffs. And so his job, and he was one of people on a team, so it wasn't just him. He literally would spend his days trying to use the advanced techniques he learned at MIT to figure out how to get the shine just right. There was a separate team that worked on crunch, getting the crunch just right. One of my favorite stories is that they had a mass spectrometer, which is like $1 million plus machine. It's a very fancy machine, and he was, using these gold-coated Cocoa Puffs, and he was going to run them on the machine. And all of a sudden, someone burst through the door, and they said, "I need the machine. I think I have a breakthrough. And they were holding 2 fruit roll-ups in their hands. And this is like, this. If you were writing a parody, this is what you would do. And the issue is that, that is what capitalism has become, right? Like, it's insane that that's what someone who has the ability to help solve the climate crisis by decarbonizing the chemicals industry was working on. And I think, by the way, it's like not only now is he much more likely to contribute to a better world, but he's also much more likely to increase global GDP, right? By working on what he's working on than by working on the sheen of Cocoa Puffs. And so, I know I call out VC a lot because that's my industry, but I think it is symptomatic of like a larger problem in capitalism as a whole. But yeah, VC has completely lost their way. Like it is an incredible privilege to have so much capital to allocate. You get to choose what things exist in the world. You get to choose what people get to say in business and not. And you have these VCs, especially in Silicon Valley, where a couple years ago, there were big forest fires, and there were days where the sky was literally orange. It sort of looked like Blade Runner 2049 if you've seen those scenes. And you had VCs tweeting about how proud they were of their most recent investment, an NFT jetpack gaming startup. And again, also did not make that up. That is a real startup that raised tens of millions of dollars. They make NFT jetpacks. And I'm sitting there being like, what, am I dreaming? Like, is this, and so this is an industry that historically was focused on finding incredibly ambitious technical founders and giving them capital to do incredibly ambitious things that, if successful, would radically move the world forward. And it seems like VC recently has been either about finding a SaaS startup that's kind of growing nicely and hoping it grows a little bit more nicely, or taking big, bold bets on NFT jetpack startups, which is it's just insane. And so I really think that the industry has an obligation to think about sort of what the world needs and to fund those things. And I think if they do that, they will actually benefit themselves and their LPs.
And I mean, so agree with you, but I think that is also in our kind of joint humbleness on that. It's something that we talk about quite a lot now at Norrsken is this kind of notion of that, well, there's some of those things that we've been kind of bashing others about that we need to be thoughtful about how we do it ourselves. That, okay, if you're an impact startup, you're clearly working on solving one of the world's greatest issues, but how do we, this that you mentioned, this kind of principled approach, if you will, how do we make sure that we as investors or we as startups actually don't fuck up other things along the way? That you may be solving climate crisis, but you're rematerializing, or I'm sure like Facebook, when they set out that they didn't have the intention to polarize the world, but they did in the end. Their second and third order effects, even of good intentions from the start. That how do you guys think about that?
Yeah, so there's 2 ways. I think the traditional way, which we definitely need more of, I think we need more like ethicists almost in Silicon Valley, and like more philosophers. And ethics should really be built into any product development. I think the default product manager in the Valley does not ask themselves these questions. They just don't ask themselves, like, is this change good for the users? Which is just insane. It's insane, and I think 50 years from now, when we look back on this time, we'll say that was insane. Yeah, unfortunately, this all started with this guy, Milton Friedman, who was a Nobel Prize-winning economist in the U.S., and he basically made the argument that the purpose of a corporation, the purpose of business, was to maximize shareholder value. and nothing else. And he said in this essay, it was a op-ed published in the New York Times, he said, and this is a quote, again, not a parody, he said, businessmen that think about anything else aside from shareholder value maximization, and he says, such as the welfare of society, or the good of the environment, or the health of the climate, these businessmen are undermining the basis of free society. And it sounds insane, but this literally, this idea of the Friedman Doctrine was at the center of capitalism for the last 50 years. I think in the last 5, thankfully, it's changing. There's the first step in that direction is what's called sort of stakeholder capitalism, where you say, when you're running a business, you should think about all the stakeholders, and your shareholders are one, but your employees are another, your community is another, your users are another, and you should think about what's good for all of them. That's a step in the right direction. For us, it's even more simple. We just try and only support things that are so radically good for the world and so radically important that even if they create some negative second-order effects, those second-order effects will be completely washed away by the positive outcome of the first effect. And so it's a particular way of thinking about it. You still always do a quick analysis of like, is there some other massive thing? But then you don't actually have to worry so much about the smaller negative side effects. And I think luckily there are many problems that are so large that if you solve them, you're in a good place. Like people don't talk about it. Heart disease kills 18 million people a year, every year, 50,000 people every day. It's just like, it's insane, the scale of it, right? In the United States during 9/11, 2,000 people died and we went to war for 10 years. And here we have something that's killing 20x that number every day. And so it's like, if you were building a startup to like cure heart disease, I wouldn't think too much about second order effects, because it's like you're probably gonna contribute very positively to the world. And so if you choose problems that are so big that where the outcome would be so great, I don't think you have to worry too much about that.
And I suppose that one of those very topical areas related to that, I assume you guys are thinking about a lot as well, is on the AI side and the development of that. How are you thinking about the potential to do good with AI and how to think about that versus managing the risks?
Oh, I think it's incredibly exciting. So since we started in 2015, there have been several like waves. There was a big drone wave in 2019 where everyone got super excited about drones, and we sort of scratched our heads and said, not sure why. And then there was obviously the big crypto wave, and everyone got excited about crypto, and we sort of scratched our heads and never understood why. And now there's the big AI wave, and we totally understand why. It's just like very exciting. It's very clear that though, of course, there's like a little bit of a bubble, at the end of the bubble, there will be unbelievable value creation that comes from this. And in particular, really important stuff. So it's, the things we're seeing now are largely around optimizing your, marketing or your sales outreach, your customer support, and like, those things are all sort of neutral. So I'm not going to scoff at them. But I think where AI holds real promise is it's basically it can be a problem-solving tool, right? It can be a tool that could help us solve the climate crisis. It could be a tool that could help us solve disease. It could be a tool that could help us accelerate science. And so I think those are the areas, the sort of application of these new sort of language model techniques towards those areas. That's what gets us very excited. And so just in biology, which is a space we're very active in synthetic biology, it's a space that's particularly great for these techniques because you're typically generating massive amounts of very relevant data, way more data than you could possibly sift through as a human. Pfizer in one day generates more data than Twitter in a year. And the nature of a lot of these AI techniques is they're such that if you just throw a bunch of data at it, it can then understand what's happening and then give you insights. And so the application of these techniques to science, to biology, to the climate, that's where we get really excited.
And I mean, from a larger point of view, like you mentioned before, with the great opportunity of being an investor, the responsibility of also deploying that in a good way. What are really the big challenges that right now keeps you awake at night?
The world challenges? I mean, I think obviously you have the climate, you've got health, you've got things like economic inequality, you've got things like education, connectivity. We think is a really big one. For us, those are like the keys. I mean, there are other ones that are interesting, but if you talk about the absolutely large ones, like those are the 5 that we care the most about.
Is there anything either related to them as a kind of, or one level down, that if you compare to when you started out then in 2015, where you're like, oh, this is some fact about the world that I really didn't know about that?
In terms of the problems?
Yeah.
We've learned a lot. I don't know if, I think so when we started, connectivity wouldn't have been on that list because we didn't realize how sort of like systemic of a good it is. So we've now backed three different companies approaching connectivity in different ways. It is literally like one of these, it's almost like education. It's like a systemic good. Like if you connect people to the internet, like everything gets better, including things like the strength of like social institutions and politics gets better. It's funny. It gets way better, and then for super developed economies, the more connected people are, the more unstable things get. This is a sort of second order effect. But again, that would be a really great problem to have if you can lift a bunch of people out of poverty and save a bunch of lives. So no, I wouldn't say on the problems. It's the problem set hasn't changed that much since we started 8 years ago.
What about on the solution side, in terms of what solutions may be possible to address them?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously there's this very, very recent, by recent I mean like last couple of years, and AI has been very, very promising. And a lot of our companies have gotten very, very far implementing sort of AI techniques 4 or 5 years ago. But the ability to sort of abstract away the ability to use these has gotten very, very interesting, right? That's I think of the last 2 years. You used to need to have like an ML scientist on the team to really make use of these techniques, and now you don't. And that's very, very interesting, because whenever that's happened in any other industry, you've just seen like a huge wave of innovation. So that's an interesting one. And then for us, we've just gotten more and more excited about synthetic biology over time. If you look at why the internet took off in the 90s, it took off because you had sort of TCP/IP figured out, you had the browser built, and then you had a bunch of like literal wires run that connected people. And the combination of those three things made launching an internet startup 10x easier and 10x cheaper. And so whenever you have 10x easier, 10x cheaper, you just typically see an explosion of innovation. And if you look at synthetic biology, and this has just accelerated over the last 8 years, it looks very, very similar. So in the synbio space, the sort of core pillars are read, write, edit, and design. And if you go through each of those, there have been massive drops in cost and complexity. The read part, typically what you read is the genome. You read DNA. There's other things, but that's the main thing. The first time we read the human genome, well over a decade ago, it took $3 billion US. It took 10 years to get it done, and researchers from 22 universities. You can now do that exact thing in a day for $300, and you need no scientists. Like that's a pretty big drop in cost and complexity. And then if you go through each of the other pillars, read, the thing you write is DNA. There's been a similar drop in the complexity and cost there. Edit, thanks to CRISPR-Cas systems, it's much easier to edit, genomes. And then when it comes to design, because of these computational techniques, that's become much easier. And so what all of these things combine to is, if you wanted to start a certain type of synbio company 15 years ago, the first step may have been raising $50 million. And you can now get just as far as that $50 million raised company with an $800,000 seed round. And that's very, very exciting. And so we're seeing just an explosion of innovation in synthetic biology. These companies are contributing to health, they're contributing to climate, they're contributing to a bunch of stuff.
Is there anything in terms of your view on what it means to be a good founder? If you think about the type of advice that you give founders in 2015 versus what you give now, is there something that has changed?
Not really. We were always one of my favorite entrepreneur. The person that I sort of think is just one of the most exceptional entrepreneurs. Unfortunately, wasn't an impact entrepreneur, but I just really, really admire the way he runs his business. Aside from that, is Jeff Bezos. So I've consumed basically everything he's ever written. Read all the books on Amazon. There's a great book called Invent and Wander, which is the sort of collected writings of his and a lot of his shareholder letters. If you want to sort of read a lot about his mindset, and he's always long-term, super disciplined, watch your costs, don't get ahead of yourself. He's sort of the anti-Elon Musk. And so we've always sort of advised our founders that way. And then on the investing side, he's also unfortunately not an impact investor, but Warren Buffett is just like really amazing at what he does. And he's very, very similar too, right? Which is just like super disciplined, think long-term, don't get caught up in euphoria. And so, from when we started in 2015 to 2021, seed valuations doubled to tripled, depending on like the data you believe. Our average post-money entry price for the startups we backed remained completely flat like literally. Literally by 200K it changed. And so when we've seen what's happened from 2020 to 2021, maybe a little bit 2019, we thought that everything was a little bit crazy. And so we've always been giving 2015 advice. And 2015 advice is basically 2023 advice. And so I think we've gotten a lot better at it because we get better at knowing how to communicate. We've seen a lot more problems that we didn't see before. But I think that if you're running a business well, a startup well, the things you're doing should be pretty consistent no matter what's happening around you. Because the way you run a great business is pretty consistent no matter what's happening in the macro. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I'm curious with a little bit of the macro, and now you being, if you will, are kind of also representative from knowing Silicon Valley and knowing the US. So a couple of things that I would just, you may not have a perspective, but then you tell me, that I think that there's a lot of conversation around here in Sweden these days. So one is around Inflation Reduction Act, and where there's a lot of excitement about that. Oh wow, the U.S. actually did that. Let's hope Europe does that. But in the meantime, should we be thinking about the U.S.? And then I think that a lot of the worry is that, well, we're kind of not trusting your political system as much as we perhaps did 10 years ago, and it's quite unstable. And so just super curious to hear from your side that, is this something that you actually trust will be
the
in
IRA?
place? Yeah.
Yeah, the IRA. So
is everyone aligned? Will it be?
It's pretty broad. It's very popular bill. So I mean, the only thing that's weird about it is the name. It's not an Inflation Reduction Act. It's a climate act, but they thought it would be more popular if they called it something else, and so they kind of fibbed about that. But I think what's interesting is that it had pretty broad appeal across both Republicans and Democrats. I think one of the things that Joe Biden has done extremely well is he has stopped talking about climate innovation as an environmental issue. He talks about it as a jobs and innovation issue, which it is. It's equally true. Talk about it one way and half of the country doesn't like it. Talk about it the other way and everybody likes it. And so he basically never talks about environmentalism or anything like that. He talks about jobs and he talks about innovation and how investing in these new climate technologies is going to bring jobs and it's going to bring innovation. And because of that, it's been very, very, very popular. He's done just a phenomenal job. And the IRA is really, really impactful. Most of the legislation that's gotten passed in climate in the United States has just not moved the needle very much. This one really, really, really changes things. It's like if for some of our companies, it's brought their time to profitability up by like 3 years. It's like that significant. There are many sort of technologies that would have really struggled with the path to profitability that now all of a sudden look very, very attractive, and money's just been flowing into the space. And so I love it. I think hopefully Europe tries to outdo us and does outdo us, because that'd be really, really great. And then, I don't know, I am actually fairly optimistic about the stability of the US political system. Deeply embarrassed by the last guy, who we don't have to name, but also, that was an example where somehow a person who really wanted to be a totalitarian, like properly wanted to be a totalitarian, became president and couldn't. And he couldn't because the courts stopped him and stopped him from doing a bunch of stuff he wanted to do. And Congress stopped him from doing a bunch of stuff he wanted to do. And so the American system of checks and balances, which we always learned about as kids and never really mattered that much. And all of a sudden you're like, oh wow, this is why they teach us about those things. All of a sudden the checks and balances came into being and they worked. And now, he's out and hopefully he's going to be behind bars soon, have a new home. Not to get too political here, but I don't know if you all know, he got indicted for many of his multitude of crimes. But yeah, so I'm very, very optimistic about the future of the United States, and especially around climate, because a lot of the jobs that are getting created in what are known as the red states, or the Republican states. And the blue states have never been a problem, because the Democrats like spending money on climate because they think it's really, really bad and we should just solve it because it's bad. And Republicans now are getting excited about climate solutions because they bring jobs.
And another area of stability, we just posed that another topic where we've all been speaking about Silicon Valley in the past months have been on Silicon Valley Bank. What is the discussion where in the US about the learnings from what happened, and what do people take away?
I don't know if any of the takeaways are particularly interesting, because what Silicon Valley Bank didn't do well is they didn't hedge interest rates. So it's not something that any entrepreneur really needs to know about, but when you're a bank, you basically use depositor money to invest, and then the returns on those investments is like how you make money. And they bought a lot of assets that, if the interest rates rose, would not be good assets anymore. And typically, if you do that, you create a hedge. So you sort of do something else where you go, just in case interest rates rise, this won't really screw us. And they didn't do that. And it was like super silly for them not to do that. But what took them down had nothing to do with Silicon Valley or technology or any of the stuff they did in technology. So, the Silicon Valley Bank is one of the only banks that will give like venture debt to startups, and like that did not get them in trouble. What got them in trouble is like something that any traditional bank could have done wrong. And I think most people don't get that. They just go Silicon Valley, like something must be wrong in Silicon Valley. But like 3 other banks failed around the same time. And there's other banks that may fail that have nothing to do with Silicon Valley for the exact same reason, because a lot of banks, it turned out, didn't hedge their interest rate risk. And so, yeah, I don't know if there's much to be learned there. As an entrepreneur, you should probably have FDIC insurance or something that's insured, and that's like a little change everyone can make. But like all the Silicon Valley Bank money got returned by Monday, so it was like, that weekend was the longest year of our lives. But literally 4 days after everything crashed, all the money was guaranteed by the federal government, which is really, really great. I think that what I hope is that entrepreneurs don't. I think it's easy to sort of overlearn, and so as a founder, you should, if you have cash, make sure that it's like insured, and then like never think about banking again, because that is literally not what's going to drive value. It's obviously important they don't lose all that money, but black swan events are very, very, very rare.
You mentioned in the beginning of the 50 years hence and all the predictions that was done then. So 50 years from now, what would you imagine? You can do it in a Utopia version and a dystopia version if you want to. But
I'm always very hesitant to do this because there's this great book called Profiles of the Future, written by this guy, Arthur C. Clarke. It was actually written in the 60s, but it's a phenomenal read. Everyone should read it. And the main thrust of the book is that people are really bad at predicting the future, including experts in the space. So one of the examples he gives is this guy, Lord Rutherford, who did more to like elucidate the internal structure of an atom than anyone, was asked about nuclear energy. And he was like, not going to happen. It's not possible. No way. Definitely not. And then literally 3 years after his death, the first controlled chain reaction happened. And this was like not just anyone. This was like the guy. This like no one knew more about atomic physics than him. And he just completely missed something that happened shortly after his death. And this book gives a bunch of examples about how like the most preeminent people in the field were asked about X, and they were either like, oh, that's like 100 years away, and then it happened 10 years later, or they were like, oh, never going to happen, and then it happened 15 years later. So if like the Lord Rutherfords of the world can't get it right, I'm not going to get it right. And so we actually are, we try and really force ourselves to not get too wrapped up in our own predictions of what's going to happen. We're sort of like, even like we're like antithesis. So one of our core values is beginner's mind, where we try and like not think that we know what's going to happen, because if we whiteboarded, the only thing I could tell you about what we whiteboarded is that it would not be right. So like we fundamentally believe that the only people that really know what is going to happen in the world are the people that are building the next wave of technology, right? It's the scientists in the lab. And so we focus instead on getting to know them, getting really, really good at supporting them, so that hopefully when they have that breakthrough, they tell us about it, and then we can run our own analysis and maybe help them build that future. But I really have no idea what the world's going to look like in 50 years. So
let's see. And if you now have then, if you will, the builders of Sweden, the investors of Sweden, both from a GP and LP capacity in the room, is there something you would like to send with this group?
I'm going to get in trouble.
You can say whatever you want.
So
talk about the socks if you want to.
Yeah. No, I'll risk being unpopular, but saying something that might actually be helpful. So the Valley is like a very, very special place, Silicon Valley, and I've thought a lot about why that is. And you have sort of like the tactical things. So for building startups, it's really important to have access to capital and talent and customers and mentorship. And Silicon Valley has all those things in like abundance. Luckily, those things are being largely democratized around the world. Investors in America will back teams in Europe over Zoom. Potential customers will get closed over Zoom. There's a lot of talent as companies, grow, and then the next generation goes off, and you've got people like Nicholas of Klarna or Nicholas of Skype or here who are like amazing mentors. So I think that from an ecosystem standpoint is like it's pretty good. It's like that's getting democratized around the world. But then you have the softer elements. You have the cultural elements, and there's basically there's like 3 cultural elements that I think are really, really important for any sort of like really burgeoning startup ecosystem. One is you need a strong counterculture. Because if you don't have a counterculture, then like what exists and what is big is good. And so like why try and take it down? Why try and change everything? You need the ability to dream extremely, extremely big, like radically big. Obviously, because if you're a couple people and you think you're going to like change an industry, that's like it's kind of crazy. But you need a culture that encourages that and promotes that and doesn't tamp that down. And then you need just an insane work ethic, because if you're not really working insanely hard, a startup is not going to succeed. And it's interesting that if you look at Silicon Valley, it was the birthplace of the counterculture movement in the United States. It's the birthplace of the psychedelics movement. It's the birthplace of like the 60s free love movement. So there's a very strong counterculture vein there. People definitely are like in the clouds all the time. If you say like some crazy idea and you're like, oh, I'm going to do this, people are more likely to say, oh, and if you did that, you know what else you could do, right? Versus even in New York, where people are likely to say, oh, geez, like here's the reasons that might not work. And everything they say will be totally like true, but like it just happens to like, tamp down those ideas. And then people in the Valley just work all the time. That's our fun. Like on Saturday, you'll have friends getting together to co-work. That's like fun Saturday in the Valley. And so you can look at different cities around the world and places and sort of judge them on those scales. And so like Tokyo is an interesting example where they dream big, they have crazy work ethic, but they have basically no counterculture. And so the people, the best in say Tokyo, they want to go work for Sony, or they want to go work for the government. They want to work for the big established corporations. And then you can look at a place like Berlin, where there's a strong counterculture, and they do dream big, but there's like no work ethic. Like, I don't know how much time you guys spend there, but like at 5:02 p.m. on a Tuesday, everyone's in the park drinking beers, and which makes Berlin an amazing place to live, and can create a thriving art scene. But like, I just do not believe that Berlin's going to have a really, really robust startup ecosystem, because people don't like to work very hard. And so when I think about this place, this part of the world, I think it's honestly the dreaming big part that is a little bit tamped down. I love the sort of like how communal the Nordics and Scandinavia are. Like, I wish we had a little bit more of that in the United States. But part of I honestly believe that any cultural value that's really great has a flip side. And this is a cultural for organization, cultural for company, anything. In the United States, it's like a very individualist culture. And that allows for dreaming big, it allows for entrepreneurship. The downside is that we don't think about the health of society, and so people don't have health insurance, and like people don't have maternity leave, and like a bunch of bad stuff. Here, it's like very, very communal, and it's great because everyone takes care of each other. But the flip side is that it's almost considered rude to like dream too big or to be too successful. And I think that really will hold back entrepreneurship, because entrepreneurship is all about really having an incredibly ambitious idea and then just running toward it as fast as you can. And so I think celebrating people who dream big and celebrating people who succeed big, expecting them to give back, of course, but like just really celebrating that's probably the biggest advice that I would give people here, because if that culture changes, I think this part of the world is like extremely well suited to be a huge startup hub.
Thank you so much. And so with that, we have a microphone that we can pass around if anyone wants to come closer to the fire and join the chat. Any questions in the team? Just behind you.
Hello.
Woo! Perfect.
Hey, Seth.
Hey.
I tend to think that the biggest failures are the things we learn from the most. So what's the biggest failure you've had in your life and what you learned from it?
I wrote about my biggest failure, actually. I wrote a blog post called Mistakes You Should Never Make. My biggest failure was I had a startup. I used to work in politics, worked for Barack Obama on his first campaign, and worked for governors and folks like that. That used to be I used to think politics was like a much better way of solving good problems than technology. I flipped on that. But I basically started a startup that built tools for political campaigns and nonprofits. Things were going really well. We got customers. We got into Y Combinator, raised a bunch of money from great Silicon Valley investors. And I was a first-time founder, first-time CEO, and I just made a ton of mistakes. So many that I had to write a very long blog post describing them all. Everything from just being a poor communicator to not being a great manager, to just like some operational messiness. But I think the biggest mistake that I made. So I dropped out of college, but when I was in college, I was in this school called the Harvard Extension School. So it's a school at Harvard that grants degrees, but it's different than Harvard College. Harvard College is like the most prestigious. Harvard Extension School is like a less prestigious version of Harvard University. And so when I started, I would say, oh yeah, I dropped out of Harvard Extension School. And then there was one time where a reporter said, would it be accurate to just say you dropped out of Harvard? And I thought like, oh, interesting. And I was like, yeah, technically that's true, right? And then like, of course, afterwards I was like, oh, I think I know why the reporter said that. It's because like, Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, they dropped out of Harvard College, and this story that they're telling will be sexier if like people think that versus that I dropped out of this other school at Harvard. And so I just went with it because I was like, oh, it's technically true, so it's fine. But technically true is like a terrible barometer for that sort of thing, right? Because like, basically what I was doing is I was like sacrificing my integrity for like a slightly better story, right? So like, so that people would think I dropped out of one school at Harvard instead of that I didn't get a degree from one school at Harvard instead of not getting a degree from another school at Harvard. And I lost some trust of people around me because of that. And at the end of the day, like your reputation and your trust, if it's good, it compounds, and it just creates this amazing foundation for you to do amazing things. But the other side is also true. And so that was a really hard lesson for me. But like I had to like sit with myself and internalize it. And so ever since then, like I've just like straight by the book, don't exaggerate a story, just tell it like it is. Yeah, that was probably the biggest like failure of mine.
Thanks. I'm seeing one
Hi.
there.
Sorry. So you mentioned admiring both Jeff Bezos and Warren Buffett, and I think you would agree with me that both of those are exceptional capital allocators. So I was just wondering about your framework for investing. Do you have an internal framework that you deploy? Why do you invest in whatever you look at, whenever you look at it, and sort of how does that process for you work?
Yeah, so I mean, ours is very simple. We just want to back really incredible founders that are working on the world's biggest problems in markets that are either already super, super large or that we're very, very sure will be very, very large. And so I guess the other sort of uniqueness of it is that we're very comfortable with technical risk, but we're not as much comfortable with business model risk. So, which is another way of saying that we like things where they're really, really hard to build, but if you build it, it's going to be really, really great. And part of the reason that we like that is we're all kind of like nerds on the team, and diving into technology and measuring technical risk is kind of fun for us. But it's also just a very, very, very underserved part of the market. Which again is like funny because like VC was invented to do that. VC, like the semiconductor industry was like what gave birth to venture, and back then it was all about finding these incredibly technically ambitious ideas, trying to figure out exactly how much technical risk there was, and then giving the founders money to like cross off some of that risk. And now most VCs are very, very uncomfortable with any technical risk, but on the flip side are very comfortable with like business model risk or like will this scale risk. And so that's kind of our model. Find amazing founders, never sacrifice on that are operating in massive markets or ones that we have a very clear thesis on why it'll be large, that are solving some of the world's biggest problems, and then be very comfortable with a large amount of technical risk so long as we can quantify it. So for us, it's like we're comfortable so long as we feel like we can quantify the technical risk, backing things where there's a 15% chance or greater that they're going to be able to build it, and the amount of time they think it's going to take for the amount of money they think it's going to take. It might sound crazy because 15 is low, but the beauty of a venture is that you get to back a bunch of founders, and all it takes is for a few of them to do really, really well, and you end up doing very, very well as a firm.
Hey Seth, fantastic interview or whatever. And very inspirational, great to not get to all the virtue signaling, but much more, that it's actually is about building companies too. You've talked about Bezos and Buffett. You didn't go to Elon peripherally. Is it zero or hero, or where are you?
Elon of what, in what year? How far pre-Twitter? No, I mean, like Elon a while ago, clear. I mean, not clear. Still, he always had some foibles, but like very, very inspiring, right? In terms of the willingness to work on things that mattered and nothing else, the ability to dream big, the ability to take big risks, the ability to call out people who weren't, the ability to inspire other people to do that, right? I think just what he did. He obviously didn't found Tesla, but just what he did, sort of investing in and then taking over the CEO role of Tesla, was amazing. And like that literally catalyzed the entire rest of the industry to start electrifying. Same with SpaceX. I don't know, frankly, like what's happened. It's like in my mind, it's like more tragic than anything else. Like I honestly don't know if there's some like mental disorders happening there, but like he has become incredibly narcissistic. He's become incredibly cruel. He's started treating marginalized groups very, very poorly, treating his employees even worse than he used to. The hero who was arguing for really hard, important things literally bought a social media company. So it's been really sad. Like I think what I see now, it's very, very hard to admire him anymore. I almost wonder. It's like we were talking about the dangers and like second order effects of social media, and like, I mean, I like don't use. I use Twitter, but I like got off Facebook a long time ago. I very rarely use Instagram because I would see myself falling into these like spirals, right? Like you post something, you get likes, and you're like, oh, how many likes did I get now? And you're checking like every 15 minutes, and you're like, what am I doing? Like this is meaningless. And I almost wonder if like he didn't fall into one of those spirals, because like obviously he gets a lot of engagement on these platforms, and I wonder if that's not like how he's finding his value these days. And it's like for me, it's like really, really sad. But yeah, it's very, very hard for me to admire the Elon of today.
Thank you. We want
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. When it comes to using biology for the environmental innovations and solutions we need, so really harnessing the intelligence of nature, how do you foresee this to develop the next 5 to 10, 15 years?
Yeah. I think that we are going to be able to, as we learn more, it's very interesting that like right now we sort of like understand more about like astrophysics and like the chemical compositions of like distant planets and stars than we do about our own biology. And luckily that's changing very quickly. One of the reasons that is changing is because historically advancements in the understanding of biology had to wait for advancements in physics, because understanding biology is limited by the extent to which we can see and engineer biology. And historically, a leap forward in how we could see or understand biology came from a new optical imaging technique or mass spec or things like this, which all come from the world of physics. And physics, unfortunately, does not move very fast. And so progress was like pretty slow in biology. Over the last 10 to 15 years, the advancements in biology that allow us to engineer it better or see it better have come from within biology. So the shining example of this is like CRISPR-Cas systems. So CRISPR, for which Jennifer Doudna won the Nobel Prize, not just Jennifer, but it now allows us to edit genes very easily and accurately. It actually came from bacteria, who have this incredible ability to defend themselves from viruses by basically taking a piece of the viral DNA and snipping it out and inserting it into their own DNA, so that they can sort of identify that's a virus if they see it again. And the way in which they are able to go and snip out the viral DNA and put it into their own DNA is just a super efficient way of editing. And so it was better than anything we thought of ourselves. And so now we basically use the same technique that bacteria did to do editing. And so now that innovations from within biology are coming from biology, you can create this virtuous cycle. So like one of the reasons software development goes so fast is things that help us develop software come from within software, which then help us create more things in software, which then help software go faster, right? And you get this. And so biology now is finally in this sort of loop. And I think it's really, really cool because the more we are able to understand biology and the way nature works, the more we'll be able to borrow great ideas from it, the more we'll be able to engineer things better, the more we'll understand, the more we'll engineer. And so, yeah, so I'm just insanely excited. I think that we're going to be able to cure a lot of diseases. I think we're going to be able to figure out new ways of producing things that are currently made from petroleum, but more sustainably. I think we're going to have a lot of really interesting bioremediation techniques. I think we're going to be able to figure out how to make crops that are resilient and therefore end malnutrition and the impact of droughts. And I think, we are the advancements in just like the big problem in health, which is just like figuring out aging and stopping it. Like that field is actually also progressing very, very well. So I wouldn't be shocked in the next 15, 20 years if we don't make huge strides in sort of like ending aging, which would be pretty great.
Thank you, Seth. This is really interesting. My name is Lars Friberg. I'm the climate strategist at Vinnova, the Swedish Innovation Agency. And I've today had several meetings on trying to launch a cathedral initiative on deep tech for carbon reduction from the biosphere. And given that you mentioned that several times, what would be your key advice for what we should do here in Sweden, given that we don't have the same VC investment in this field in Sweden? And yeah, what's your advice there?
If I was like a policymaker, I think probably the thing I would focus on most is figuring out ways of promoting translation from academia. So right now in an academic lab somewhere in the world, there's like a scientist that's either working on or has figured out a solution to basically every problem that we're facing. The issue is that oftentimes those innovations end up in a published journal article, and then that's it. And published journal articles don't solve problems. And the people that are best equipped to translate or bring those solutions out into the world are the inventors that did it. But the path from being a scientist in academia to being an entrepreneur is really, really, really tough. And it's tough in the United States. It's even tougher in most countries throughout Europe. And so if I was a policymaker and I wanted to promote just general innovation and like GDP growth, but also help use deep tech to decarbonize, that's probably where I would focus my efforts. Is like, how do we help universities and help the PhDs and researchers at these universities like start companies based off of their research? And there's a lot of things you can do, right? You can create programs that sort of give the mentorship. You can make the tech transfer policy, meaning for most universities, if IP is developed by someone at a university, the person who invented it doesn't own it. The university owns it, and they have to kind of get rights from the university to do anything with it, making that process as easy and seamless and quick as possible. I think that would be a huge, and like the level of technical talent at research universities in Europe is just like very, very, very high. But the translation is not, the translation sort of percentages are not nearly where they are in the States. And so that's where I would focus. Got one clap back there. Thank you. Fan of translation.
Final question.
Final question.
Woohoo.
Lovely. So, as a founder from Sweden, is it worthwhile to send the pitch deck to you guys?
Yeah. Hello at 50.vc, FIFTY.v. What a great question to end on.
Exactly.
Yeah. I'll give you your €20 after that. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, if anyone's working on something that utilizes technology that can solve a huge problem in the world and that can make a ton of money, and if you're really excited about both of those things, if you're both deeply excited about the impact, but also deeply excited about building an incredibly valuable business, and you're at the very, very early stages, hello at FIFTY.vc.
Awesome. Thank you, Morten, and thank you, Seth.
Thank you. That was fun.
You'll get a
Cheers.
hug.